not playing this shit. We just gonna go from here. If the shit don't work right, we gonna cut it. Oopsie doobs, cause I ain't got no time to go get no charger, bitch. So she can shut the up real quick. Ow, shit. What's up, guys? Babs Money here with another episode of Dragatha Christie's Unsolved Mysteries, bitch. And today, I want to do a case about a woman who used her white privilege in the right way and actually lost her life doing so. I wanted to start a bunch of cases with black victims of color because there's not enough coverage of that, and the police have a notorious and abysmal failure of solving black homicides. Y'all don't even know 40s realness. So with that being said, today we are going to talk about the assassination of civil rights activist Viola Liuzzo. This occurred on March 25th, 1965 on Highway 80 outside of Selma, Alabama. So this was almost 5.5 decades ago, which just goes to show how important the civil rights movement is. Because yes, this was a white woman, but at the same time, many black people were being killed. And this wasn't even 100 years ago. Today's look, I kind of feel like I look like the mom from Matilda, but I just wanted to go for a 40s element, and I figured if I can have 2 videos in a row where I have a green eye, I can do a blue eye moment the same damn way, bitch. Viola Fauvert Gregg was born on April 11th, 1925 in the small town of California, Pennsylvania. Her mother was a school teacher and her father was a coal miner and a World War I veteran. Her family was very poor and they had to live in one-room shacks that had no running water. Having spent much of her childhood and adolescence growing up poor in Tennessee, Viola experienced the segregated nature of the South firsthand. And because of that, it was during her formative years that she fully realized the injustices of segregation and racism. And this was mainly because her family, although in similar conditions of poverty, were still afforded social privileges and amenities that were denied to black people under the Jim Crow laws, even though they were just as poor. Her family eventually moved to Ypsilanti, Michigan, and then Detroit, which was starkly segregated at that time, and tension between whites and blacks was at an all-time high. And during this time period, there was a lot of violence, a lot of rioting. It was witnessing these ordeals in Detroit that would further motivate Viola in her civil rights work. She ended up marrying Teamsters Union business agent Anthony Liuzzo. And shortly after, Viola sought to return to school and attended Carnegie Institute in Detroit. It was in 1964 that Mrs. Liuzzo would join the NAACP, otherwise known as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. A large part of her activism with them was due to her very close friendship with a woman by the name of Sarah Evans, and I was only able to find one picture of her, and this happens to be a picture of her with Viola. They initially had met in a grocery store where Viola was working as a cashier, and they continued to keep in touch after their meeting. Sarah eventually became Viola's housekeeper and would maintain a very close, friendly relationship with her. In fact, after the events of Mrs. Liuzzo's death, Sarah Evans would go on to become the permanent caretaker of Viola's children. Viola was someone who so passionately believed in the fight for civil rights that she organized protests, she attended civil rights conferences, all while working with the NAACP. And ultimately had a strong desire to make a difference on as large a scale as she could. So now we are going to get into the events of Selma. It was in February of 1965 that the fight for civil rights in the town of Selma, Alabama, by the death of a man named Jimmy Lee Jackson, who was beat and shot by state troopers at a night demonstration for voting rights outside of the Perry County Courthouse in Marion, Alabama. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, also known as the SCLC, scheduled a protest march for Sunday, March 7th. Alabama Governor George Wallace banned the march, but this ban was ignored. For those of you who don't know, Governor Wallace is the despicable racist who is infamous for saying, and I quote, "Segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever," end quote. one of the most vile people to ever hold a position of power, in my opinion. When the 600 marchers reached the crest of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they saw state troopers on the other side, state troopers that were armed with clubs, whips, and tear gas, and God knows what else. And it's hearing about stuff like this that really makes recent events resonate with you, because this is exactly what happened to black people back then, and it's happening again now, 55 years later, and it's not okay. The troopers, of course, ordered them to stop and disperse, and the marchers refused, at which point the troopers advanced on them. The troopers clubbed and whipped them, fracturing bones and gashing heads. Ultimately, 17 people were hospitalized in the events of the day that came to be known as Bloody Sunday. People always talk about, why are people angry? Why can't they be peaceful? Why do they have to riot? This is why. Because 600 people were peacefully marching for their right to vote as human beings, and 17 of them ended up in the hospital because these white men didn't see them as human beings and proceeded to beat them like animals. So that's why. Because this is still happening to black people, and it shouldn't be. And it should have never happened in the first place. Viola saw these images of the aborted march, and she was absolutely horrified. A second march took place 2 days later on March 9th. And on that night, a group of white people beat and murdered a minister by the name of James Reeb, who died 2 days later from his injuries. Reeb had also come to Selma to march with the second group. And this was something that really shook me, because I had no idea that there were, first of all, but second of all, so many white people who actually gave a shit about the civil rights movement back then and wanted things to be made right for black people. A week later, on March 16th, Viola took part in a protest at Wayne State. She then called her husband and told him that she would be traveling from Detroit to Selma after hearing Dr. King call for people of all faiths to come and help. And she told her husband that she was doing so because this was, quote, everybody's fight, end quote. She left her children in the care of family and friends and contacted the SCLC, who took her on and tasked her with delivering aid to various locations. This included welcoming and recruiting volunteers, as well as transporting volunteers and marchers to and from airports, bus terminals, train stations, etc. And it was for these tasks that she volunteered the use of her 1963 Oldsmobile. On March 21st, more than 3,000 people began the Third March. Many participated, including Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his wife Coretta Scott King, political scientist Ralph Bunche, Baptist minister Ralph Abernathy, and politician/diplomat Andrew Young. Liuzzo marched for the first full day and returned to Selma that night. That Wednesday, March 24th, she rejoined the march 4 miles from the end, where a Night of the Stars celebration was held, with performances by many popular entertainers of the day. Hold on, it's turn up time in here, baby. It's turn up time, bitch. It was on Thursday that Mrs. Liuzzo and other marchers reached the Alabama State Capitol building with a Confederate flag flying above it. Dr. King addressed the crowd of 25,000 people, calling the march, quote, a shining moment in American history, end quote. After the third march concluded on Thursday, March 25th, 1965, Mrs. Liuzzo, who was being assisted by Leroy Moten, who was a 19-year-old black man, and she was continuing to shuttle volunteers and marchers from Montgomery back to Selma in her car. At one point, a car tried to run her car off the road as they were riding along Highway 80. So they dropped their passengers off, and while they're stopping at a gas station, they of course are subject to racist scorn. Eventually, they leave to get back on the road. And when Viola is stopped at a red light, a car with 4 local Klansmen pulled up alongside her. And when they saw a white woman in a car with a black man, they proceeded to follow Viola as she tried to outrun them. They managed to overtake the Oldsmobile and shot directly at her, hitting her twice in the head and mortally wounding her. Her car veered into a ditch, crashing into a fence. And Leroy Moten, who was not struck by the bullets, but was covered in blood, laid motionless when the Klansmen came to the car to check on their victims. After they leave, Leroy eventually flags down a truck that is being driven by Reverend Leon Riley from California. Ironically, Reverend Riley had come from California to Alabama, heeding the call of Dr. King, and like Mrs. Liuzzo, was shuttling volunteers and marchers in his truck. Less than 2 weeks after her death, a charred cross was found in front of 4 Detroit homes, including the Liuzzo residence. The 4 Klansmen in the car were quickly arrested and identified. They were 34-year-old FBI informant Gary Thomas Rowe Jr., and the other 3 men were Collie Wilkins, age 21, 42-year-old Eugene Thomas, and 41-year-old William Eaton. Within 24 hours, President Lyndon B. Johnson appeared on television to announce the 4 men's arrest. In order to avoid bad press, President Johnson chose to focus on the positive fact that the FBI agents had solved the murder in order to avoid scrutiny that Gary Thomas Rowe Jr. was an FBI informant and therefore protected by the Bureau. The other 3 men were indicted in the state of Alabama for Liuzzo's death on April 22nd, 1965. Mr. Rowe was not indicted and served as a witness like the scared little bitch he was. Him. He testified that Wilkins had fired 2 shots on Thomas's orders. The next phase of the lengthy process, in this case, was when a federal trial charged the defendants with conspiracy to intimidate African Americans under the 1871 Ku Klux Klan Act. However, the charges did not refer specifically to Mrs. Liuzzo's murder. Bullshit. The trio were found guilty by a jury that was not only all male, but all white. And they were sentenced to 10 years in prison. And this was a landmark in Southern legal history, as you can imagine. While they were out on appeal, Mr. Wilkins and Mr. Thomas were both found guilty of firearms violations and were sent to jail for those crimes. During this period, the Birmingham News published an ad for Viola Liuzzo's bullet-ridden car, asking for $3,500. The ad read, quote, "Do you need a crowd getter? I have a 1963 Oldsmobile 2-door in which Mrs. Viola Liuzzo was killed. Bullet holes in everything intact. Ideal to bring in crowds." End quote. So they were treating the car this woman was murdered in as some sideshow spectacle. After all 3 defendants were convicted, state murder cases proceeded against Mr. Eaton and Mr. Thomas. Eaton remained out of jail but died of a heart attack on March 9th. Eugene Thomas's trial got underway on September 26, 1966. The prosecution built a strong case that included an FBI ballistics expert testifying that a bullet removed from Mrs. Liuzzo's brain had been fired from a revolver that Mr. Thomas owned. Gotcha, bitch. Now here's where it gets suspicious. Despite the presence of 8 black people on the jury, Thomas was acquitted of the murder charge the following day, after just 90 minutes of deliberations. Only an hour and a half, and 2/3 of the jury is black. Somehow he's acquitted. Well, State Attorney General Richmond Flowers Sr. criticized the verdict and derided the black members of the panel, who he referred to as Uncle Toms. And for my viewers who don't know, Uncle Tom is a phrase that refers to black people who put up with the abuse of white people and are kind and forgiving of them because they are afforded privileges other black people are not. And it comes from the book Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. On April 27th, 1967, the 5th Circuit Court of Appeals in New Orleans upheld the federal convictions of the surviving defendants. Thomas would only end up serving 6 years in prison for the crime, which doesn't surprise me because while Viola Liuzzo was not black, she was a civil rights activist who cared very deeply for the fight for justice for black people, and so no one cared about her. Due to threats from the Ku Klux Klan both before and after his testimony, FBI informant Gary Rowe went into the Federal Witness Protection Program. He eventually died in 1998 in Savannah, Georgia. Good riddance, bitch. Within 24 hours of Mrs. Liuzzo's assassination, J. Edgar Hoover began a smear campaign to the press, claiming that the cut marks on Mrs. Liuzzo from the car's shattered window were, quote, puncture marks in her arm indicating recent use of a hypodermic needle, end quote. And then adding, quote, she was sitting very, very close to that Negro in the car, that it has the appearance of a necking party, end quote. A necking party, for those of you who don't know, was just a fancy phrase for a tryst, having some fun with somebody in the car. So now they're trying to say she was over here like doing heroin and fucking somebody. As if even if she was, that was any excuse to kill her. Not to mention, autopsy testing in 1965 showed no signs of drugs in Mrs. Liuzzo's system at the time of her death, nor had she had sex recently at the time of her death. The FBI's role in the smear campaign was uncovered in 1978 by her children, who obtained case documents from the FBI under the Freedom of Information Act. Liuzzo was condemned by several racist organizations for, in their eyes, bringing her death upon herself. They believed that her immersion in the civil rights movement was something so radical and controversial that it was a dangerous undertaking that led to an inevitable death. And it should be noted that Viola's death was the only one scrutinized in such a way, as other male activists who died at this time were considered heroes. Gary Rowe was indicted in 1978 and tried for his involvement in the murder. The first trial ended in a hung jury, and he was acquitted in the second. On May 27th, 1983, Judge Charles Wycliffe Joyner, who from what I've read is a piece of shit, rejected the claims in the Liuzzo family lawsuit, saying that there was, quote, no evidence the FBI was in any type of joint venture with Rowe or a conspiracy against Mrs. Liuzzo. Rowe's presence in the car was the principal reason why the crime was solved so quickly, end quote. In response to the verdict, the Liuzzo family's lawyer and civil rights activist Dean A. Robb said, quote, this is a terrible opinion. I'm shocked. I think this is incredible, end quote. In August 1983, the FBI was awarded $79,873 in court costs, but this was later reduced to $3,645 after the ACLU appealed on behalf of the family. Sorry if the frame's different. My camcorder was about to die, so I had to rush to cut that bitch off so I wouldn't lose all this. In 2011, the Viola Liuzzo Ethics Scholarship was started at Adrian College in Michigan by her grandson Joshua James Liuzzo. She is played by actress Tara Ox in the 2014 film Selma, which is about the marches, and a statue honoring her memory was unveiled in Detroit last year. Viola's life and death loosely inspired an episode of the CBS drama Cold Case, Season 6, Episode 3, Wednesday's Women. The case involves a woman named Miriam Forrester who uses Tupperware selling as a cover to help colored schools and is eventually killed by members of the Klan. You can actually find this episode on the Roku channel. You don't even have to have a Roku stick. You can use your phone or your computer to go on the Roku website. You can sign on as a guest. But that is the case of the murder and assassination of Viola Liuzzo, and it is considered unsolved due to the fact that no one was ever really convicted for her murder. And that's on period, because what's the f***ing tea, bitch? But anyways, we all know what happened, so this is one instance where I'm not gonna say, hey guys, what do you think happened? Everyone knows who killed her, they just got away with it. And with this case being told, I am now going to move on into the many cases of unsolved homicides with black victims that I was able to find. And I believe I'm going to start either with the case of O'Neal Moore, which I am going to tie in with another case simply because there is not a lot of information on it, but it is a story that needs to be told. And I also want to talk about the murder of Kendrick Johnson that happened a few years ago in Valdosta, Georgia, a case that has haunted me and I don't believe has gotten the coverage it deserves, nor the justice it deserves, quite frankly, so I'm going to get into that. But for the foreseeable future, I would like to cover black victims and tell their stories like they should be. be, because as a white person, I understand that I will never understand. But I stand with you, my heart hurts for you, and while it might not be much, I want to use my platform in any way that I can to tell your stories. So comment below, give me some cases, ideas, thoughts, and just remember that you too can use your privilege in the right way. No one's saying you have to be James Reeb or Viola Liuzzo, but be a voice for people like Jimmy Lee Jackson, for people like O'Neal Moore, for people like Tamla Horsford, for people like Sandra Bland, for people like Breonna Taylor. Just be a voice. It's what I'm doing. This channel and this content is something that I care about a lot, and I feel it is only right to use something so important to me that can also reach so many people out in the world. And with that being said, as always, I am Babs Money, aka Dragatha Christie, and I am signing off for now. Until next time, money chasers. Good night! I'm about to get on Facebook Live and be like, oops.